Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. A couple of leagues ago, there was a pretty significant overhaul to Heist in PathOfExile, and this resulted in a few massive jackpot items being added to the game. Things like the Simplex Amulet, the Focused Amulet, the Helical Ring, those are the massive jackpots, but also the Tailoring Orb and the Tempering Orb were made much more common than they used to be. This has of course resulted in them becoming quite a bit cheaper than they used to be as well, but they are still something you're always happy to see. And additionally, a number of replica uniques were added, things like Replica Badge of the Brotherhood, Replica Heat Shiver, and today what I wanted to look at is a massive data collection effort that's been undertaken by people in the PathOfExile community who have almost reverse engineered the Heist loot tables. Now the sample size is a little bit limiting, and that's true even though the sample size is so large. Almost 30,000 curio case items were tracked, and so you might be thinking that that's a large enough sample size to pin down everything. In practice, it's enough to pin down really accurately all the things that hundreds of were found. For example, many hundreds of the unique Replica Prism Weave were found, and so its drop rate can be pinned down pretty accurately. Likewise, many hundreds of Divine Orbs were found, and so their drop rate can be pinned down pretty accurately. But for the things that only dozens or fewer than a dozen were found, there's a fair bit of variance still, and in order to really pin down those drop rates, you'd need to go much larger sample sizes. We're talking recording 250,000 curios, maybe even a full million curios if you want to get the very rarest items down. That said, every single item that can drop was found, with the exception of Replica Bated Breath, which is known to be ridiculously rare, and it's probably the only tier 0 rarity item in Heist. Side note, the Sacred Orb was the rarest currency item that was found. Eldritch Chaos Orbs, Eldritch Annuls, Eldritch Exalts, those are all more common than Sacred Orbs. They were not found at all. As a result, I'm inclined to believe they can't drop. Hinekora's Lock, Mirror of Kalandra, neither of these were found either. And I'm inclined to believe that they also cannot drop in a Heist curio. That the only things you can get if you get rare currency are Divine Orbs, Exalted Orbs, Orbs of Annulment, or Sacred Orbs. And there's definitely some thank yous that need to go out for this video. So there's Heglion, who did over 2,000 blueprint wings himself, and there's also the people in the Prohibited Library Discord who have been doing some fairly carefully controlled information gathering on a heist individually. No individual there quite as much as Heglion, but collectively they've got even more. Between everyone that's been involved in this project, over 30,000 heist curios have been recorded, and they've been recorded on a basis of we're recording them whether they're exciting or not, which means that you end up getting much better data out of them. Let's dig into the major findings. There might be a minor flashbang warning here, but I am going to dim this in post so that it's not quite as blinding as it might otherwise be. So let's start with the big headline figures, although it's important to note that on these, because there's been 10 or fewer copies of these items found, variance is actually pretty high despite the sample size of nearly 30,000 curios. So, 2 Focused Amulets, 1 Simplex Amulet, and 10 Helical Rings were pulled out of this experiment. And honestly, we can't say whether the people involved in the experiment got unusually lucky, or unusually unlucky, or somewhere in between in getting those sorts of numbers. What we can do, however, is start to categorize things into tiers based upon how often it was pulled out. This tiering is most clear when we have a look at the replica uniques. Replica Cortex, Headhunter, Shroud of the Lightless, Dustdawn, Kongor's Undying Rage, and Tukahama's Fortress appear to form a solid tier 1. It's not absolutely certain the barrier between tiers 1 and 2. It's possible, for instance, that maybe Replica Dustdawn is actually tier 2, and Replica Atziri's Acuity is actually tier 1, and the people involved in the experiment just got a little bit of variance there. However, all of the other tier borders are very clear. Any specific tier 1 item seems to show up about once per 2,000 wings. Then we have the tier 2 ones, which seem to show up about once per 500 wings. These include Atziri's Acuity, Farrell's Fur, Hiri's Ire, Windripper, Eternity Shroud, Nebulous, Maloney's Mechanism, Poorjoy's Asylum, Tripanon, Badge of the Brotherhood, the Covenant, and Replica Elberon's Warpath. Interestingly, the people involved in this got more copies of Replica Elberon's Warpath than anything else in tier 2, although I do think that's just pure coincidence. Replica Elberon's Warpath is definitely the most sought after of these in most leagues, although sometimes it's Replica Farrell's Fur. Tier 3 has a lot more items in it. Replica Pillars of Arun, Replica Allure, Replica Frostbreath, which can be quite valuable if it's got a perfect attack speed roll on it, and then a whole bunch of other things. Replica Heat Shiver goes in there, but probably most interestingly in tier 3, 2 items that can be very valuable right at the start of a league. Replica Atziri's Foible and Replica Soul Tether. If you're someone who likes heisting, these are going to be your meat and potatoes in days 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of a league, when they can both be quite valuable. And of course we've got one of my favourite meme items, Replica Paradoxica, which is pretty much always worthless, but is a lot of fun. We then have a big jump in rarity from tier 3 to tier 4, and you can see this here. The most common of the tier 3 items were Replica Cold Iron Point and Replica Soul Strike, which the people involved in the experiment got 73 of each of them. Then Doedre's Damning is 197, and it was the rarest of the tier 4s. Tier 4 has some very good items, Replica Karui Ward, which always sells but is generally not that expensive. Replica Dream Feather, which is one of those uniques that's worth quite a bit if it's got a perfect attack speed roll on it. And a couple other things that see occasional use. And then we have a clear tier 5 as well, with a big jump between tiers 4 and 5. And tier 5 has Replica Prism Weave as the best item that's in it, although that is definitely a leveling item only. Anyways, what I've done as well as that is I've then gone and slotted into those tiers all of the other items that can drop as well, so that you can have a bit of a sense as to just how rare things are compared to things that may be more familiar. And that's been my main role in this project, finding ways to make things a bit more presentable. So you can see here that Focused Amulet and Simplex Amulet are in tier 1, because they do seem to be among the rarest items that you can get out of Heist, as well as things like Crest of Desire. Something a lot of people don't realise exists in Heist, there is a multi-mod version of the weapon enchants and the armor enchants. The armor enchant version of this can be quite valuable. It's not always, it needs to be on a really good base, but it's something to keep your eye out for. It's something that I was looking to see if Heglion could prove was rarer than all of the other enchants, and actually we weren't able to do that. Across the entire experiment, there were about 2,000 pieces of armor that were enchanted that were pulled out of Heist, and exactly 8 of those were multi-modded. But because there are so many different armor enchantments, this is not enough to prove that any of them are rarer than the others. That said, I do still suspect that the multi-mod enchant is at least twice as rare, maybe 5 times as rare as the rest of the enchants that you can get out of Heist on armor. Pretty much all of the other Heist experimented jewelry is in tier 2, but then a lot of the other experimented bases are either in tier 2.5 if they're minimum level 50, or tier 3 if they're minimum level 70. When I say tier 2.5, what I mean is that it's just more common than tier 2 drops but rarer than tier 3 drops. And I wanted to clarify by calling it tier 2.5 that whilst there is nothing between tier 2 and tier 3 for replica uniques, there is definitely space in between them when it comes to the other awards in Heist. What I think will probably excite people the most though is to see some of the things that are found in tier 4. The Tailoring Orb, the Tempering Orb, and the Divine Orb, as well as the Exalted Orb, but you're probably less concerned about that. All of those actually fit into tier 4 in this breakdown, which is something that gives Heist a lot more consistent income. You're generally going to see about 1 Tailoring Orb, about 1 Tempering Orb, and about 1 Divine Orb for every 25 wings that you run. Of course, some of the time you will see more than one of these at a time, and you're only going to be able to take one. The other thing that's quite nice to see is that large stacks of Chaos Orbs end up being in tier 6. They're the most common of the large stacks of currency that you'll get, and whilst getting a stack of 17, 18, 19 or 20 Chaos Orbs is not exciting, it is something that's always welcome if there's nothing else to pick from in that particular Heist. One other thing I've built into the spreadsheet is a tiering system for the value of the various things that you can pull out. Now this is not a promise that they're always going to be worth this much, but instead it's a broad strokes rule of thumb as to whether this item is likely to be a jackpot pull. So S tier is something that is always a massive jackpot, something that you think is always meaningfully better than a stack of 20 Divine Orbs would be. A tier is things that are going to be better than a Divine Orb a lot of the time. B tier is things that are going to be a Divine Orb down to a Fortunate card. C tier will be Fortunate card down to a stack of 10 Chaos. And then D tier is derisory stuff, and I think I've got an E tier in there as well, but that's basically D tier. If I call out that something is RNG based, that means that the item may or may not be worth quite a bit more than is indicated, but that depends upon its rolls or some other factor. For example, Crest of Desire, I put that in B tier because it's not worth a lot, although it is generally worth something, but it's not worth a lot unless it has +8 to the level of socketed skill gems. But if it's got +8 to the level of socketed skill gems, and especially if it's got upwards of 45% quality on it, then that's going to be something that can be worth quite a bit. The most extreme of these RNG cases, in A tier we've got Enchanted Armor that has Multimod on it. This is something that is pretty much worthless unless it's on a Satyrs Garb, a Veil Regalia, or some other top tier base. And when we go down to the very, very bottom and go to the most common rewards you can get out of Heist, Enchanted Armor, Enchanted Weapons, and Trinkets, these are things you'll see all the time. The vast majority of them will be pretty much worthless, but they're always worth looking at because sometimes you'll get something that is meaningfully better than you're expecting. So always keep an eye out for those. Anyways, I'll put a link to the spreadsheet with a summary of results down in the description below, as well as to Heglion's write-up from 3 weeks ago over on the PathOfExile subreddit, which is also definitely worth a look, and you'll be able to download all of the raw data from there, especially if you wanted to get your own insights and maybe group things together in slightly different ways to how I've done it. A few other important things got tested during this. Probably the most important one is that at some point around the start of this year, there was a test that was run that was discussed a lot on the PathOfExile subreddit. I think a person did 1,000 blueprint wings where they did single wing blueprints with no additional unveils, and then 1,000 wings where they were 4 wing blueprints, and they got wildly different results when it came to the drop rates of tailoring orbs and of tempering orbs. This led people to believe that grinding games might have programmed in a hidden favoritism towards the 4th wing that is on a blueprint. That was tested extensively by Heglion, and the most important thing that was done here was tracking the numbers of the common replica uniques, all of the tier 5 ones, because they do show up a very large amount of the time. Any of these you'll see about once per 12 wings, so you're going to see these all the time, and they track them meticulously over hundreds and hundreds of wings. From doing this, Heglion was able to conclude that there was no bias towards getting better or different items when you're running the 4th wing than there is for the 1st wing. And given that the original Reddit discussion that caused this hypothesis to gain some popularity was by someone who was trustworthy and who's posted a lot of good faith posts on the PathOfExile subreddit over a long period of time, what I suspect happened here is that either there was a game bug that was impacting tailoring orb and tempering orb drops that was patched out pretty quickly during that league, or alternately, that good old-fashioned human error was involved. Maybe they had 20 tailoring orbs sitting in their stash that they'd completely forgotten about, and they ended up getting included in with all of the loot that they were able to farm when they did their 1,000 runs. There is, however, still one other thing that hasn't been tested yet to the best of my knowledge, and that is whether rarity, quantity, or just the number of zone mods found on a heist, whether that has any impact on the things you pull out of the Curios at the end of them. Most people speculate that the answer is no, but to the best of my knowledge, this hasn't been ruled out yet either, and that might be something interesting to explore in the future. Anyways, that's the loot tables for Heist. Definitely download the information if you're interested. I'm going to leave it there. May your Heist Curios contain interesting loot.